We're going to start off again with a short quiz. There's fewer questions on this one. But some of you I know read the book of Exodus this week. I had one person tell me how boring it was. So I don't want to call anybody out on that, make Ellen feel bad, but it was, I was surprised to hear it. But in all seriousness, these are just basically some questions from Exodus. Again, this is just an opportunity. I don't expect you all to know all the answers to this, but it gives you a few clues of things to be listening for as we go through tonight's talk. And you'll pick up. Doesn't have to say this, but I will remind you all not to use your phones. I can't believe it. 2 weeks in a row.
Why were the Israelites in the desert? There's another No, these are not all this. Like down there, and he puts a staff in the river, and the river turns red, and then there was wind. No, the wind.
Okay, let's see what you came up with. For 2 weeks now, I've panicked at this moment because I realized I didn't write the answers down. So, yeah.
So you're going to put on my phone?
Yeah. Trust me. Where do we first meet Moses in the book of Exodus? In the basket, that's right. Sweet little baby floating down the river.
Okay, so we're halfway.
Why does Moses flee Egypt? Moses killed an overseer that was overseeing the slaves, and the penalty for killing another Egyptian would have been death. So he fled out of fear. What was the name of the mountain where Moses saw the burning bush? There are two separate ones.
Mount Sinai.
Sinai. Anybody get the second one? People at Wednesday Bible School should have gotten it today. Horeb. That's correct. So one is a Hebrew name, one is a Midianite name. Horeb or Sinai, the holy mountain. Name the 10 plagues.
Yes.
Okay, maybe let's hear it again.
First, the Nile turns to blood.
Yes.
Correct.
Second, it's the frogs.
Correct.
The third one is the gnats.
Or lice, yeah.
Yeah, the fourth one is flies. The fifth one is all the livestock are infected with the disease and they die. The sixth one is they all get covered with boils. The seventh one is a big hailstorm that kills people and animals. The eighth one is the locusts. The ninth one is 3 days of darkness.
Yep.
And the 10th one is the death of the firstborn everything.
All right. From where did Moses view the promised land? Mount Tabor? No. Nope. It was from the Ararat Range, but not Mount Ararat. Anybody get it?
That was close enough.
half credit. There you go. So it's named two different ways. It says it goes up to Mount Nebo, but then it says it goes to Mount Pisgah to actually look out over. So we'll give credit for either of those. And in this country, you'll see a lot of Mount Pisgahs. There was one that we could see from both my parents and Laura's parents' house, and almost every mountain range has a Mount Pisgah in the U.S. at least. So Mount Pisgah or Mount Nebo. Why were the Israelites in the desert for 40 years?
It took false idols. She needed to.
No, it wasn't false idols. They got through that. Chapter 32 of Exodus, they create the golden calf. They still weren't stuck in the desert.
God needed to mold them to make them his people.
Okay, she said God needed to mold them into his people. That is a piece of it. But there's a specific incident. Everybody knows it? We'll go over it tonight, so we'll just leave it. What was the role of the Levites? Priests. That's correct. They were the priestly nation. So that leads me into a question that someone very astutely asked me last week at the end of our study. They said, I believe it was you, I don't care, said, I looked at this map. You said it was the 12 sons of Jacob. Where's Joseph? Is he a tribe? And I said, no. That wasn't a very good answer. Actually, Jacob blesses two of Joseph's sons and gives them an inheritance, Manasseh and Ephraim. And so Joseph's portion, you see there is the largest between those two, is broken up between them. But it still begs a question, right? Okay, so we take away one, we've added two. How are there still 12? Who do we not see there as one of the tribes of Israel with land?
There was some who didn't get land, but they did something else.
Exactly, we just talked about it. The Levites. Levi did not get a land inheritance because they were to serve all the nation as the priests. So that's how you get from 13 back down to 12. Levi does not receive an inheritance of the land. Did you all hear that? So for the Mormons, it suggested you have 12 children. The church, for what it's worth, has done that throughout history. It used to be the Roman Catholic encouraged lots of babies because Roman Catholic parents make Roman Catholic babies, and so forth and so on. So a number of churches have done that. You could argue that Israel does that. We're about to talk about that in many respects. All right. So our story really begins, I said we'd be talking in Exodus, but our story really begins at the end of Genesis. When Joseph, remember Joseph, Jacob's youngest, he's sold into slavery. His brothers throw him in the pit, they're going to kill him, and then they say, hey, well, why not make a little money off this? We'll sell him into slavery. So he's selling to the Egyptians, go down. He becomes a servant in a powerful person's house named Potiphar. Things are going really well. Potiphar puts him in charge of things, and Potiphar is thriving. And then Potiphar's wife comes along. Yes, it happens. It always happens. Potiphar's wife comes along and says, I want you to sleep with me. He said, no, not going to do it. No, I want you to. No, if you don't, I'm going to tell him you've done these horrible things to me. Do what you have to. So she's good to her word. She does it. He gets thrown in prison. And at that time, prison was a little bit different than we think of it. It would sometimes be in the basement of someone's home, essentially. It could be. It wasn't typically a huge prison set off outside the gates, or it wasn't like that. It was something akin often to house arrest, but it could be on a larger scale than that. There could be a dozen, 20, sometimes more. But he's thrown into prison through no fault of his own, but he remains faithful. He remains faithful. And while he's in prison, they each have these visions and these dreams. And the cupbearers is that in 3 days you'll be back. Joseph interprets these dreams for him. He says, in 3 days you'll be back in your old position, being the cupbearer for the Pharaoh. And the baker has his dream, and there's birds eating the bread off his head and stuff. And he says, in 3 days you'll be beheaded, and the birds will pick at your innards. And that's exactly what happens. Yeah. So fast forward, the cupbearer is back with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's having these dreams, and he can't interpret them. And he searches out in all his wise men and everything, somebody to interpret this dream, and they can't do it. The cupbearer says, I remember someone. I remember this Hebrew who could interpret dreams. Pharaoh sends for him. And Joseph interprets his dreams. To me, it's a bizarre scene, because here's this guy coming out of prison, he interprets a dream, and Pharaoh says, all right, I'm going to put you in charge of the whole country. What? I just, a day out of prison, that's a good deal. I'm in charge of the whole country? Yes, you're in charge of the whole country. They prepare for 7 years of famine. They have 7 years of plenty. He stores up all the things to get through the famine. All right? So it's at that point, during the famine, his brothers come down to get food because Egypt is one of the few places in the world then when there was a famine that would typically produce, because the Nile would flood each year, and they had water systems and so forth. So they come down, and Joseph recognizes them. Long story short, tells them who he is. There's a beautiful reunion. Joseph doesn't seek retribution. He doesn't seek to set things right with them. He says to them, you planned this for evil, but God intended it for good. God had a plan. He shows tremendous faith. And it's at that point that he sends for his father, and his father and all their families come. And there's about 70 of them. Remember that number, 70. There is 70 of them that come and settle in the land of Goshen, which is an incredibly fertile piece of Egypt. The Pharaoh really lavishes Joseph with kind of the best of everything. So they get to settle in this beautiful land. These 70 people. This 70 people becomes the nation of Israel. And in 400 and something years, 500 years, so they're enslaved for 400 and something years. In that time, they come out several million strong. They've grown from these 70. God has blessed their time. And so the question often gets raised, why did they get enslaved anyway? Why this, why that? And there's a lot of arguments that could be made, but one of the historical kind of traditional interpretations of this is that God took them to a place that had the ability to raise a nation. And Goshen was one of the few places where they could thrive on what was around them. That they could grow families, as many kids as you could put out, the land could support. And they grow this tremendous nation. It says when they leave, there's 600,000 men, plus the women and children and the elderly and so forth. Several million people are who come out of the land of Egypt. And if you remember from last week, Abraham, this was foretold to Abraham. God says, I'm going to do this and this and this, and your descendants will have this land, but first they're going to go and be enslaved in Egypt for 400 and something years. And he tells them exactly what's going to happen. And that is exactly what happens. So they enter slavery around 1800 BC. The Exodus is sometime around 1440. And we actually know a lot about Egypt around this time. You all have heard of King Tut and everything that came out of his tomb and all the understanding that people kind of derived about the nation of Egypt. Well, that was only he was buried about 80 years after the Israelites left. So the two are very, very similar. We have as good a picture as we have of any time in the ancient world in that place. We have a good picture of that. So they know what this land of Egypt was about. So when we look at the book of Exodus, it's really broken up into three sections. The first, say what's 9 chapters, are about the redemption. It's about God redeeming the people of Israel. Okay? And then you have another section of that must be the first 19 chapters. Yeah, it'd be the first 19 chapters. That's the plagues, all that we talk about. Then after that, you have the giving of the law, and then you have the people's response to that. So in a similar way, Moses' life is broken up into 3 stages. So we see him as a baby, right? And what does Exodus tell us about his childhood? Absolutely nothing. Right? It says he's a baby, he was taken into the Pharaoh's household, and when he was grown, blah. That's all. That's what we're told. He goes from baby to grown to killing this overseer. But he spends, it's believed, about these first 40 years, the first 40 years in Pharaoh's house. He was adopted as a son of Pharaoh. Okay? So he lives in Pharaoh's, or of Pharaoh's sister at least. So he lives in the palace. Great privilege, great luxury, education, etc. But he murders the overseer. Then he spends the next 40 years living out in the wilderness, living with Jethro and his daughters who were married as a herder. Does anybody see anything miraculous going on here?
So did Joseph kill an overseer and so did Moses?
No, Joseph never did.
No.
Joseph died as an old man. Joseph went to jail because he wouldn't sleep with Potiphar's wife, and then she said, I'm going to tell him you did all this terrible stuff. He's raised in the palace. He understands that life. He understands those people. And then for the next 40 years, he's put out in the wilderness.
Is this when we find out that his mother or somebody acknowledges that he is not Pharaoh's and that he's adopted?
No, we never know. We were never told that.
Okay.
So we had multiple questions there. Somebody said, when was he told that he was adopted? We don't know. We don't know the answer to that. We don't know how he knew that, because it simply says after he was grown, he's out and he sees his people being oppressed. And this overseer is beating this Israelite just mercilessly. And Pharaoh goes up and hits him over the head and he ends up dying. Okay? And so that's why it was a response to get this overseer to stop beating this slave here. So he spent the first 40 years in the palace, the next 40 years in the wilderness with Jethro, learning how to live in the wilderness. So this is a man who is uniquely prepared to go to Pharaoh and say, free my people, and then take them out in the desert to live for the next, supposed to have been a year or less, ends up being 40. But he's been given kind of a unique background and a unique set of skills. Did I see a hand up here somewhere? No. So that's a good question. Did Moses know that he was a Hebrew? He seems to. He seems to know that is because it reads that he sees them oppressing his people. He's identified with the Hebrews, with the Israelites. We're not told how, when, why, where.
Was he not raised by his mother?
No, she breastfed him. So she was his nurse, and then he went back to live in the palace. So we don't know, did he have sisters that came around? Hey, Moses, did his parents still come around regularly? Probably not. The Pharaoh's palace wasn't somewhere that anybody could just walk up to and go and hang out with the kids. And, it wasn't. It would not have been that open. Did he know his story from birth? Had they told him, hey, we found you in a basket? And even the basket story doesn't say, oh, well, this is definitely a Hebrew baby. The assumption is made, right? Pharaoh's sister assumes, well, this is one of the Hebrew babies. Because remember, Pharaoh said, all the babies have to be thrown all the male babies have to be thrown in the river and drowned. That's why his mom puts him in the basket, floats him down the river. So she comes right there. She knows when Pharaoh's sister comes out in the morning. She gets right above it, right at the right time, and releases him, hoping for mercy.
So where do Aaron and Miriam fit into this? How does that all fit in the family?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the connection. We're only told later, Aaron is your brother.
Movies,
It's in the movie, so it's got to be. Yeah. So no, later on when Moses is arguing with God, God says, I want to send you. And he's like, I'm not so good at speaking. I don't want to do that. He says, I'm going to send your brother Aaron. Okay. So there we go. We don't know, we're not told that he leaves Egypt with his family. He may very well have. We're not sure. Or I'm not. We're not going to quote that. Right? So he's uniquely qualified to do this job. He's sent out. He goes to Pharaoh. Now, you've got to remember, right now, in this point, Egypt is the superpower of the world. And I don't mean like a superpower. I mean like the U.S., China, and Russia combined. It is the superpower. Everyone else is just a rinky-dink country. Now, there are countries, Mesopotamian things that are vibrant and growing, and they do trade with them and stuff. But yes, so we don't know for sure. Now I know that Charlton Heston's movie is very clear about who it was and that it was his brother. But the truth is, historically, we don't know. There's actually as many as 3 pharaohs that people say it might be. Most people think it was Ramses. And of course there were 3 Ramesses, but they don't know for sure. At least I say that some people would say they know for sure, but it's been a point that's been argued for millennia. So.
Because for 40 years he's dealing with Jethro, and so would a new Pharaoh even know who he is?
It would have most likely been one of his contemporaries. So it would have been a cousin, whatever, cousin, brother, somebody at that first cousin kind of level to him. So yes, I think they would have known who he was, most likely. So he goes and he walks in Pharaoh's palace and he says, let God's people go. Let us go out to the wilderness 3 days away and make sacrifices to our God. And what does Pharaoh do? Naturally he says, no, that's ridiculous. Get away. And Moses says to him, well, if you don't, I'm going to bring these plagues upon you. And he shows him his power, right? He throws down his staff and it becomes a snake, right? But somehow or another, Pharaoh's magicians do the same thing. But then, yes, Moses' snake swallows the other snakes. Just the whole thing is weird. But that's what happens. And so we go through these different plagues. Maybe already named them for us. We have these 10 different plagues. And you got to remember, in a period of what they believe to be about 40 days, that number is significant, obviously. But based on what we know about certain plagues last a certain amount of time, and then Moses came down to the river, and when Pharaoh was going to be there, it was about 40 days. They go from, we don't know this guy, don't know the God of Israel, nothing, to, we're not sending them, to the people of Israel walking out of Egypt with Egypt's wealth, with several million of their slaves, with their livestock. It's a remarkable thing to think about. And never was a sword drawn that we're aware of. Never was a battle fought. This was the hand of God from beginning to end. It's an incredible, incredible thing for the most powerful nation in the world to be brought to its knees religiously, financially, politically, in such a short amount of time. And God does this to deliver his people. And he did it, in part we know that, the nation of Israel leaves with the wealth of Egypt because this is how they survived, right? They take their livestock out and so they become a part of the sacrificial system. They become, this gold and this silver become things that are put into the tabernacle on the Ark of the Covenant and so forth. But as much as anything, it's a statement to the rest of the world about the power of the God of Israel. And we know that that's true because later on in Joshua, what would it be, chapter 2, we see Joshua, this is just after Moses dies, Joshua sends spies into Jericho. Remember who they meet? Anybody remember? They meet the prostitute Rahab. And Rahab comes to them, and people come to her house and say, where are those Israelites? She said, they're already gone, they left. If you hurry, you can catch them. And she goes back up and she tells them, she says, look, everyone in this land, and the phrase is an interesting one, he says, melting in fear in the face of you Israelites, because we heard about what your God did in Egypt. This is 40 plus years later, right? 40 years or so later, they said, we heard, we know how powerful your God is, and we know that your God has given this land into your hands, and we are melting in fear before you. And this is what, I'm not going to get into that because that's going to be next week, but this kind of thing continues to happen. So, anyway, so Moses takes them out of Egypt. And what are some of the miracles that happen along the way?
Red Sea.
The Red Sea, that's the one everybody knows, right? The sea is parted and they walk on dry ground to their safety. The pursuers got drowned. And God leads them, remember, at night by a pillar of fire, and by day by a pillar of smoke. And God is leading them out into this wilderness. But what's their reaction?
They grumble.
They're hungry, they grumble, they continue to do that. They say, boy, it would have been better. It would have been better to be slaves back in Egypt where at least we had a little bit to eat. And God says, look, I've delivered you from slavery. I've done all these things. I've performed these great signs. Do you really think I brought you out here to die? Is that really what you think the plan is? But you think about that, us as human beings. That's often how we act, right? We've been given tremendous gifts and this and that and the other. And we look at it and we say, well, boy, it sure would have been better if I'd done that or done this. Or, the gifts I've gotten aren't really as much as I deserve. Whatever the case might be.
It was yesterday. Yeah.
But they grumble and they groan, and he keeps referring to them as stiff-necked people, right? And so they go out into the wilderness. This wilderness experience should have taken less than a year. It took them about 8 months to work down the peninsula of Sinai. From there, it was another 2 weeks' walk to the Promised Land. This should have been less than a year. But two things happen, and I don't know if on your quiz I said I would accept two answers to that question, but there's sort of two things. So one situation is where Moses at Meribah, he strikes the rock to grant them water. But God had said to him, God says to him, Moses, I want you to speak to the rock. And when you speak to the rock, it will pour forth water. And Moses gets angry with the people because they're grumbling and groaning. He goes out and he says, you want us to give you water? And he bangs the staff on the rock. And water indeed does pour out. But God says to Moses, now remember, Moses has questioned God on multiple occasions. He said, I'm not the person for this job. And not only does he say that once, he keeps whining about his inability to talk, right? He brings it up multiple times. He keeps complaining, he keeps doubting. He never gets in trouble for any of that. But this moment, he gets in trouble for, because he did not do what God specifically asked him to do. And he took credit for God's miracle. And so that's when God says to Moses, you and Aaron will never enter the Promised Land. But that's just two of them. Now remember, we've already seen the golden calf. Right? Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, comes back down. They've created this golden calf, Exodus 32. That was exactly what they would have been worshiping in Egypt. The exact kind of idol. Golden calf, very popular idol.
They were doing more things.
They were doing a lot of things they should have been doing. And God doesn't punish them. That's not enough to keep them out of the Promised Land. But this not doing exactly what God specifically asked Moses to do keeps him out. And later, the reason that they all end up staying in the desert for 40 years, and why God says everyone who is 20 or older at this moment will die before you enter the Promised Land. The reason for that is that when they send out spies and they come back, Moses sends out spies, they come back, and they say, there's a lot of people down there, and they're huge. They're giants. We cannot possibly stand against them. And for that, for their lack of faith, God says, this generation, this doubtful, strong-necked generation must die away before I take you into the Promised Land. Because the point of this wilderness experience, the point of them coming out to the mountain, was incredibly important. You see, they had been living in Egypt for 400 and something years. For all practical purposes, they were Egyptians. They dressed like Egyptians, they thought like Egyptians, they talked like Egyptians, they acted like Egyptians. And so God brings them out to Mount Sinai, and he says, I want to make of you a new people. And this is a phrase you need to remember. He says, to be a light to the nations. I want you to be a light to the nations. This was the whole point of Israel. God is not playing favorites here. If you remember in the book of Joshua, Joshua's standing out there, and he's going out on a scouting trip, and he sees this man coming towards him with his sword drawn, and Joshua says, "Who are you? And are you for us or against us?" And the figure replies, "Neither. I'm for God. I'm for God." And Joseph falls down and worships him. He said it's the commander of the Lord's army, but I believe it is God himself, because any time in the Old Testament somebody worships something other than God, everybody's like, "Whoa, no, stop, no, don't do that." But that's not the case in this. So Joseph sees God, or rather Joshua sees God, and God says, "I'm not for you or against you. I'm for me." And God was setting the nation of Israel there in a very specific place to be a light to the nations. You see, the land of Canaan was not the most bountiful place on earth. That was Egypt. It was not the most luxurious place on earth. That would be Mesopotamia. But it was the one place that the whole known world had to pass through to get to anywhere. Because on one side you have the Mediterranean Sea, on the other side you have the desert, above you have the mountains of Ararat. So if you were coming from anywhere in Mesopotamia to Egypt or back and forth, and that was the whole known world at that point, you had to pass through Canaan. Through that little bitty piece of the Fertile Crescent, with a special purpose, to be a light to the people. I want to show you how to be different. The phrase he uses over and over again with them is, "Be holy as I am holy." And this use of the word holy here, you might think of be different. Be set apart from the world as I am different or set apart from the world. Be holy as I am holy. He wanted to make a people, a nation, and a nation that looked different. When we read through the laws and you read through Leviticus, there's so much of it that we look at and we think, well, that's weird. That's so weird. I mean, there's one whole chapter on, not to be too graphic here, but who to have sex with. It says you can't have sex with your mom, you can't have sex with your cousin, with your kids, with your goats, the list goes on and on. You think, was that necessary? The answer is yes. It was necessary. That was exactly the culture they had come from. It was a pagan culture where anything and everything that felt good was good to go. And so God is telling him, I want you to be a new people. The dietary laws that we think are so strange, if you read through them, you will see that most of the dietary laws were really about good sanitation. You know, don't eat pork. In a culture that didn't have refrigeration, those of you know pork rots from the inside out. You don't know when it's bad until you've eaten it. Beef, other red meat rots from the outside in. You cut the bad part off, cook it, kill it, whatever the case might be. So much of these things that we think of, oh, these are these strange laws, they were God's way of saying, I want you to be healthy and thriving. I want to make a great nation out of you. In order to do that, you're going to need to change the way you eat. And he talks about, this is how you treat one another. If you kill somebody, this is the penalty. If you steal from somebody, this is the penalty, etc., etc. And in some ways, in the ancient world, this set of laws had a moral compass that others didn't. You've often heard people say, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And we typically say it in our culture, like, give them what's coming to them. But God gives that law and says to them, look, if someone steals from you, you don't get to go kill them. It's about equal justice, not dropping the hammer on people. And that was something that was not the norm in the ancient world. You steal from somebody, we'll kill you. It's fair. That was the, so there's this loving aspect to this giving of this law. But the point of it, the point of all this, the point that I want you to understand that you really need to take with you, because all of the failings, all of the struggles moving forward are rooted in this point, that God put them there to be a light to the nations. He wanted everyone else in the known world to be able to see what it looked like to live a life in perfect union with God. He wanted people to pass through the nation of Israel and say, this is what it's like. This is how life is when you live righteously before a righteous God. That's what I want. That's what was supposed to happen. That's what was supposed to happen. But it didn't. It didn't. And over and over and over again, the nation of Israel will struggle, falling short of that calling. I think that's probably all I need to do tonight because I've already run over time. Do y'all have questions? Yeah, I know we've got some little ones ready. Questions about any of that?
So the millions that thrived
Yes.
in Egypt, the millions are the ones who left. Millions.
Millions, yes. Probably, it was anywhere from 2 to 3.5 million people that left Egypt.
Wow.
You think about that as a caravan, that's a remarkable thing.
That's huge.
It's huge, humongous.
Starting in the 70s.
And then for them to support themselves in the wilderness for 40 years, well, obviously God has to step in and get the manna, get the doves or pigeons.
You said Moses never made it to the promised land.
Moses got to go up on Mount Nebo or Mount Pisgah and look out on the promised land, but he never entered
Is
it.
that the end of the 40 years?
Yes.
So he was 120 years old.
120 years old when he dies, and God buries him somewhere in the plains there of Moab. They don't know where, but yes, nobody knows where it is. But yeah, so he's 120, and it said that he was vigorous, still had his eyesight and all his capacities, still in good health. And God says, "Okay, it's time," and goes up on the mountain, he dies, and God buries him in the plains there.
And wasn't that kind of young?
Was that young then? I think if you were lucky enough to make it past 20, then yeah, you could live.
Wasn't some of them living to this?
So that ends prior to that. So the people living to 800 and 900, Noah and all them, God cut that off with Methuselah.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? So next week we will get into Joshua. We'll start getting into the history. Maybe we'll get into some of the wisdom literature and some of that. If you have questions, just let me know. Oh, one last thing. I want to tell you, I want to make this point. That God gave them the law for 2 reasons. One, as I said, he wanted to make of them a new nation, but also he needed them to understand that when there is sin, the penalty is death. And we'll talk more about that in the Levitical system, the sacrificial system. But that was a piece of what he wanted the people to understand. And I'll try to remember to talk about that next week, because that sacrificial system is a question that comes up a lot. And why would God do that, and what's the point? So we can talk about that a little bit next week. I'll try to remember. If I forget, remind me.